And Kathy, you are all set. Please go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me, Laura?
Yes, we can hear you, Kathy.
Okay, great. So understanding Tourette and other neurological disorders. I've been working with families and schools, and I have 3 children. 2 of them do have Tourette. So I've been interested in working with families and schools regarding Tourette syndrome and the related neurological disorders for the past 30 years. As Laura said, I've done many presentations. So yes, please ask questions. You are not going to ask any questions that I haven't already been asked, and if you do, then that's a bonus. So it's not going to my next slide. There we go. So neurological disorders and tic disorders. There are tic disorders that aren't necessarily Tourette. So transient tics are typically young children, and the symptoms last less than a year. Since it is genetic, and so it is in my family. But my grandchildren both had tics, but they were transient because they didn't last. They didn't last very long. A chronic tic disorder is either motor or vocal. I have a chronic motor tic. I've had it all my life. I have a tic that I have to do something with my neck to complete the urge. You'll learn that all symptoms are due to urges. So I have an urge. It's kind of like a scratch. So in order to itch it, I have to do this certain movement. But I've never had vocal tics, so I don't have Tourette itself. I just have the chronic tic disorder. And Tourette syndrome, in order to have Tourette, you have to have both motor and vocal, and it has to last more than a year. And pretty much it's lifelong. You'll see in a minute that it does get better sometimes, but it is pretty much lifelong condition. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, estimates that 1 in 100 people have tic disorders and 1 in 164 have Tourette. So if you think that Tourette and tic disorders are not common, that's a misperception, because 1 in 100 really is not rare. It's relatively common. So if you are interested and wondering and want to see somebody about getting a diagnosis can be provided by a pediatrician or a psychiatrist. I actually prefer a neurologist because it is a neurological disorder. And the city of Rochester and other places in New York State, we have quite a few Tourette centers of excellence. In Rochester, it's the University of Rochester, and there is the telephone number, and they also have a website you can check. So tics, what are tics? They're involuntary. They may look purposeful, but they're involuntary. They're repetitive movements and vocalizations. Like I said, they're due to physiological urges. So if you have a mosquito bite, you have a strong urge to scratch that mosquito bite. You may be able to suppress scratching it or ignore it for a while, but it's going to come back. And the need to satisfy is very, very strong. And when people do their tics, it provides only temporary relief of the urge. Tics can range from mild to very severe. They may be hardly noticeable, or they could be self-injurious and debilitating. The tics change. Everything about Tourette is kind of confusing. So if the tics, like my chronic neck tic, I mean, I've had it all my life, but with Tourette, tics usually change. And so you just get used to one tic, and then another one will occur. The frequency, it can be very obvious. It can be very frequent. The tics can be every minute, or they can be once an hour or once a day. So the frequency changes and the severity changes. Like I said, you can have very mild to very severe. And again, kids will say it sort of feels like when you have to sneeze, you know you have to do it, and it's all you can think about until you do. So suppressing your symptoms, it can be helpful at times, but it also can be very interfering. So some examples, and these are only a few examples. I really can't tell you every tic that could be possible because there just are way too many. So a simple motor tic typically involves one group of muscles. So eye blinking, facial grimace, jaw movements, head or neck jerking, shoulder shrugging, arm jerking, etc. More complex tics could be hopping, twirling, jumping, sticking the tongue out, kissing, pinching. Copopraxia. Copopraxia is a scientific name for giving somebody the finger. And the fact that there's a scientific name for that has always kind of amused me. But it is a symptom, and my son had that symptom. Fortunately, it didn't last for very long. Vocal tics. Some examples, probably the most common are throat clearing and sniffing, but there's also grunting and hooting and shouting and screeching. Some of the more complex vocal tics are phrases that may or may not be recognizable and may occur in or out of context. A lot of people have told me that they say, well, I know this isn't Tourette because it's in context. It can be in context. So it can be just a random statement or phrase or word or sound, or it could make sense to the conversation, to the environment. It still is involuntary. They still don't want to do it. So some of the vocal tics are cochlealia. Everybody unfortunately knows that one. It's obscene words or socially inappropriate. Less than 10% of people who have Tourette actually do have cochlealia as a symptom. So we still hear from doctors even that will say, well, it's not Tourette because the kid's not swearing. You really don't need to swear in order to have Tourette. Echolalia is repeating words or vocalizations of others, and this can be pretty annoying, particularly in school if the teacher is saying something and the kid will say it even 1 or 2 times after the teacher has said it. And palalia is repeating one's own syllables, words, or phrases. So a person that will say something, and usually it's like the last 2 words or the last word that they will repeat. So Tourette is complex, has a variety of symptoms. It makes it difficult. It's difficult to recognize, support, and understand. So symptoms are usually unique to the individual. I mean, there are some common ones, like I said, but if you know one person with Tourette, you know one person with Tourette. We hear too often people will say that, I know what Tourette is. I've worked with a person with Tourette. I know that these symptoms are not due to Tourette. They can be. Every person is unique. Every person is an individual. The symptoms can change and they can wax and wane. So for no apparent reason, they get better and they can get worse. We do know that stress almost always will make symptoms worse. So that's the one thing that we do know will make symptoms worse. And then you need to go with the individual. Sometimes it's smells, sometimes it's food, sometimes it's something in the environment will kick off the symptoms. Well, like I said, stress increases. And another hard thing is that symptoms are suggestible. Now, one of the things that we do as adults, we will tell a youngster, now remember, don't touch the fire alarm when we go onto the hallway. Well, by saying that, they have put it in the person's brain, making it harder to suppress. So when we suggest something, it's like it makes it worse rather than better. So everything we know about, working with children and giving them suggestions may not work with a kid with Tourette. So the ability to suppress, it's inconsistent and varies from one person to another, and it interferes with concentration. So people will say, well, they should just suppress all the time they're in school. Well, when they do that, half of their brain is thinking about suppressing, which interferes with their ability to concentrate. And depending on the severity and the environment, the child may struggle to manage their tics. And I use the word manage because a person cannot control or stop their symptoms, whether it's tics or the co-occurring conditions. But if it's something that is really, truly harmful for the person in whatever way, we want to work with the person to try to help them figure out a way to manage the tics. And it's working with the person, and it can take some time, but sometimes it is possible. Other times it's not, but it's very, very difficult to manage your tics. So Rose Woods wrote a book a while ago called Disinhibition Syndrome. Disinhibition. It's the condition for people that have neurological disorders that limit a person's ability to use his inhibitory process and learned inhibitory skills. Oftentimes what we do for people with tics or Tourette or behaviors that that are inappropriate, we think that they don't know what to do that's appropriate. They do know. They know, it's just that they can't inhibit it in the moment. And again, the behaviors can be contextual or non-contextual. It can be movements, behaviors, swearing, inappropriate comments, emotional outbursts, rage, infantile behaviors, just about anything. So it's a disability of disinhibition. And I'm doing another webinar for Starbridge, and we'll be talking about how to better manage behaviors, and I'll be talking more about the disinhibition. But I wanted to include this slide. I used to be an English teacher, so science is not necessarily my major thing. But I thought this was a great slide. It talks about the basal ganglia part of the brain. It's associated with a variety of functions. So it helps inhibit and control motor movement, speech, and emotions. And you'll see on the video at the top of the brain where it says basal ganglia, and then there's some writing in red. I didn't write that. Some scientists did, but it's so critically important because it's the basal ganglia that chooses which actions to perform at the moment. So it's sort of the brakes of the brain. It says, no, that's really not a good idea. But for people with neurological disorders, sometimes their basal ganglia isn't functioning properly because of the imbalance of chemistry due to Tourette and tic disorders. So the braking system is inconsistent. So it is a neurodevelopment disorder, and people typically start noticing tics around the age of 5 and 7, but everything, you'll see a lot of typically, you'll see a lot of some. There's really not a hard and fast rule for most things with Tourette. The tics, again, typically increase between the ages of 8 and 12. Some people with tic disorders show noticeable improvement in late adolescence, but approximately a quarter of people will continue to have persistent and severe tics into adulthood. And this can be very interfering for the person's life. You can just imagine getting a job or, having a relationship. So the prevalence, this comes from the CDC, and I already mentioned that 1 out of every 100 children has Tourette or another tic disorder, where 1 out of every 160 children have full-blown Tourette. And And the most upsetting statistic for me is that an estimated 50% of the people with Tourette go undiagnosed. So, you know, people, I mean, they look normal and they have average to above average intellectual abilities. Lots of times they have skills. So we don't jump at the fact that maybe they have some kind of diagnosis going on. So a person's life with Tourette is very, very difficult, but having it undiagnosed is just beyond horrible. So some of the common co-occurring conditions with Tourette, and this is a very popular graphic. An awful lot of people say that this opened their brain to what Tourette is. It's so 86% of people who do have Tourette have co-occurring conditions. So it's very rare that anybody would just have tics if they have true Tourette syndrome. So the motor tics and the vocal tics, you know, we hear the vocal tics, we see the motor tics, but what we don't understand is, why is their handwriting terrible? Why are they depressed? And a majority of people with Tourette have attention deficit disorder. They have obsessive compulsive behaviors. The difference between obsessive compulsive disorder, and I'm not saying that people with Tourette don't have a diagnosis of OCD, they can, but most people with Tourette, they have more of a Tourettic obsessive compulsive, because regular OCD is more fear-based. You know, I've got to wash my hands 100 times because of the germs, whereas obsessive compulsive behaviors with Tourette is more, it's more tic-like because it's because of an urge. If you're working with somebody and they say, you know, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I just have to do it. Again, we go back to the mosquito bite. It's scratching that itch. It's a strong urge that they have to touch something 5 times, or they have to touch the fire alarm when they're in the hall, or they have to say certain things. It's an or they have perfectionism. Obsessive compulsive behaviors can be very, very difficult. Social communication deficit. This gets confused with autism, because say you've got a smart kid that is having some tics, has poor eye contact and poor social interactions. Unfortunately, what we too often do is say that you know, that they're on the spectrum, that used to be called Asperger's, that they're on the autism spectrum. They may not be. There's a lot of kids with Tourette who are very, very bright, but have major social communication deficits. So, you know, what's the big deal if you decide it's autism or Tourette? We deal with it differently. So kids with Tourette, as I said, you know, they know how to act appropriately. We don't have to train them or teach them what to do and what not to do. What we do need to do is look at why they're having difficulties with social communications. Is it their anxiety? A lot of kids with Tourette do have anxiety issues, and they want to have friends. So on the playground, they'll, you know, be talking to somebody and they want to impress these people because they want them to have friends. And so they'll say something that could be very inappropriate. And it's more because of anxiety. The anxiety kind of takes over and interferes with their knowing what to say and what to do. So social communication deficit can be very difficult. An awful lot of kids have sensory processing issues, which again is confusing toward the spectrum disorders. So, you know, the sensory, needing more sensory input or avoiding sensory input, you know, the fire alarms can be horrible for these kids, for these people. Too many people, crowded areas, you know, a whole lot of different things. Executive function deficits. Executive functioning is the ability to be organized. It's sort of like the frontal lobe of the brain. It's sort of like the executive secretary for the person. It helps organize things. It tells you, you know, time management. So many kids with Tourette are very bright, but they can't display how bright they are because their organization abilities is just terrible. So one of the things that that we advocate for people with Tourette is to have somebody help them develop executive functioning skills. Again, it's not teaching them specific ones necessarily, because again, they're individuals, and they may have some that are unique to them. A lot of people have difficult times transitioning. They do have the impulsivity, and during the next webinar, I'll be talking about the difference between impulsivity and disinhibition. It's really important when trying to determine if a behavior is purposeful or is something that is part of their disability. Anxiety is very rampant amongst people with tic disorders. And the anxiety, so you got the anxiety, which increases tics, and tics oftentimes, if you're out in public, will increase your anxiety. So that's kind of a cyclical thing that can be very problematic. Sleep issues can be difficult. Lots of times people will be thinking about a topic and they just can't get that topic out of their brain. They have to do certain things, so sleeping can be a problem. I talked about disinhibition, behavioral issues, and rage. It's just within the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years that anybody has recognized that rage can be a symptom of Tourette. Again, I'll be talking more about that in the next webinar, but what happens for kids and families that have families of kids that have the rage is that the families get blamed. You know, here's this smart kid, and lots of times they are appropriate in the outside world, and the only place they display their rage is at home. I understand why it appears to be the parents' fault or the kid's fault, but it really is. It's that basal ganglia that all of a sudden isn't able to control the emotions, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger because of the chemistry of the brain. And it's not because of poor parenting or a bad person. So I made up this diagram. The co-occurring disorders, some people call them co-occurring, some people call them related. Most of the doctors that deal with people with Tourette call them comorbid. And I understand comorbid, the word is kind of scary and yucky, but the comorbid means that they impact each other. And this diagram sort of displays that. And it shows you, it's a nice visual for really understanding how difficult it is for people with Tourette to get through every day. So almost always they have attention deficit or executive functioning, which is distractible, always writing difficulties, and it just interferes with their ability to be successful. The disinhibition talked about with the mental breaks. The sensory, some people, you know, they avoid overstimulation. Some people need increased sensory input. So you'll see a lot of kids with picking or biting their nails. They have to do something that actually causes them pain. in order to get the sensory input that's needed. And then there's some kids that are both. They are overstimulated and understimulated. Then there's the obsessive compulsive, the strong and specific urges. I have to complete this. I can't move on until I complete this. It's avoidance. I know I'm not going to be able to do it perfectly, so I'm not going to do it at all. Or I know I'm really terrible in gym, or the gym smells, so I'm going to avoid going to gym. They can appear to be inflexible. And a lot of times we'll see people with Tourette diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. If you are not familiar with Ross Green, I would recommend, and again, I'll talk more about that in the next webinar. But a lot of doctors will say that people, that it's chronically inflexible rather than oppositional defiant. So you mix together the executive functioning ADD and the obsessive compulsive, and you have a need to be perfect, but you've got writing difficulties and you're disorganized. So your need for perfection is interfered by the executive functioning. So there's a strong sense of failure. The ADD and the disinhibition, again, the comments, the inappropriate comments, the inappropriate emotions and joking. Social skills and the disinhibition kind of interact and make the social skills deficit much, much worse. A lot of kids will appear to be immature. There's doctors that state that people with Tourette syndrome are typically emotionally 3/4 their chronological age. And a lot of people with Tourette have a hard time making and keeping friends. Not always. Everything I say is not always. The sensory and the obsessive compulsive, you have to touch something, must touch it. A lot of people can't wear socks or can't wear clothes with seams. And again, they they might hurt themselves. Now you got all that going on, but you still got all the tics going on that you're trying to suppress, but you're still doing all your tics. You're focusing on suppressing them, and what ends up is you're very, very frustrated. A lot of kids will give up. A lot of kids will be angry. A lot of kids will have rage. And it's understandable. I mean, if you look at this visual and you think about the kid every day, I mean, it's tough. They have a hard life. It amazes me that most kids are, they go to school and they persevere. They really are amazing individuals. So getting help at school, people will say, well, when should I talk to people about this? So if the symptoms interfere with the academics and or their social life, I say tell the school right away, because they're going to be wondering. Everybody's going to be wondering, why does he keep clearing his throat? Why does he, make these funny faces? Rolling eyes is a very common symptom that we adults really don't like. So when a teacher or somebody knows that the kid has Tourette, and that rolling eyes is a common tic, that can be very, very helpful. Educating the entire school staff. Now that's really hard. The Tourette Association, we offer resources and in-services. But I understand that it's hard to educate the entire staff, but it's really important to try to educate the librarian, the people that are going to come in contact with the child on a regular basis. Educating classmates. This is something I hear a lot, that they're afraid by educating the classmates that there's going to be more bullying. We have found that by educating the classmates, there's actually less bullying. Particularly if you can do it at an early age, because kids are going to bully when they don't know what's going on. It's weird. Why is this kid doing this weird stuff? And if there's a real strength of the child, my son is absolutely a phenomenal drummer and always has been. So by supporting his drumming, people would less bully him, knowing that he's a good drummer, but also knowing that this is Tourette. Kids can understand a whole lot more than we adults think they can. And if necessary, request the special education assessments or evaluations. They're also known as psychoeducational evaluations. They're necessary when requesting an IEP or a 504 plan. And there are sample request letters on the Starbridge website, as well as on the Tourette Syndrome Association website. The evaluations and the assessments are really important. A lot of times kids will do well in elementary school because their intellect hides their disabilities, but then they get into middle school and higher, and their disabilities start interfering with their intellectual abilities. So by having an assessment early on and recognizing, oh, this kid has executive function difficulties, that's a good thing for us to know, so we can start working on that right away. Supports and resources. Starbridge can provide you with advocacy. They have Tourette Connect meetings. They offer trainings like this one. They offer lots of trainings. They have a parent training and information center, which is funded by the federal government and provides information to parents and educators. And I would really recommend, if you're interested in tic disorders or Tourette, I would highly recommend that you look at this video. I think there's four or five videos that we did at Starbridge, and it's interviews with parents, educators, and youngsters. And it really is excellent. I'm not saying that because I was part of it. I actually was not sure that it was going to be good when I first found out about it, but boy, they did a good job. And you'll really, especially the parent one. If you're a parent, I would really strongly recommend that you look at the parenting one. And I work part-time. I actually have worked both places. I've worked for Starbridge back when it was called the Advocacy Center, and I worked for the Tourette Association of America as a consultant now. So the Tourette Association offers webinars, in-services, even team meetings. I attend a lot of team meetings by phone to answer specific questions. We offer medical training because doctors still are not aware enough. We have a website with all sorts of resources, and there's videos on the YouTube channel, the Tourette YouTube channel, or I guess it's not called a channel, the Tourette YouTube site. So I hope there are questions. I kind of ran through this quickly, and it was kind of a 101, but I hope there are some questions I can answer for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you so much for all that great information. We actually do have several questions. The first one is, can you develop a tic later in life?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. You probably had, maybe you had attention deficit, maybe you had some other kind of neurological thing going on. And typically when it develops later in life, it's during a time of stress. Because when the person is not under a great deal of stress, the chemistry in the brain doesn't impact the basal ganglia. But when there is a lot of stress, it will impact the basal ganglia and end up in either tics or some kind of emotional outburst. So yes, you can. In order to have Tourette, it's like all the developmental disabilities. You're supposed to be able to have it before you're 21, but I have heard from a lot of adults that, once they're out of school and once they're trying to get a job, if they're in a very stressful situation, they will develop some tics.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is asking about what they should ask or know about a doctor who can diagnose their child with Tourette.
Good question. A neurologist should know. That's why I usually recommend neurologists. Psychiatrists are starting to be better at it. In the past, psychiatrists would be too quick to blame the behaviors on emotional disorders, or the kid just trying to get attention, or the parents being bad parents. Our son actually was diagnosed with his pediatrician back in 1990. So she was unusual. So it can be a pediatrician. I would want to ask if they are familiar with Tourette. And if they say, yeah, I've worked with some kids with Tourette, maybe you want to ask some questions. What do you think of? Could you give me some examples of some of the comorbid disorders that go along with Tourette? Do you think that tics can be controlled? I hear a lot of parents say that their doctor tells their child that they can control it if they really want to. So I guess if you have the opportunity to ask some questions, yeah, I would ask some pointed questions that you know the answers to. It would be a good idea.
Great, thank you. The next question is that they went to get their child diagnosed. They didn't show their oral tics during the evaluation, and then as soon as they left, they started, yelling. Their tics came out, and it was yelling it very aggressively. So, can you hold back a vocal tic?
Yep. That is actually exactly what happened with my son. Heaven forbid he should show the doctor any of his tics. So it's very common. It's like holding back the, scratching the mosquito bite. You can suppress, it's hard. And when you get into a safe place, you're going to scratch the heck out of it. So lots of times kids, they will suppress scratching that itch until they get to a safe place. And what some people do is secretly videotape their child. I think it's a good idea. I personally didn't do it. I didn't need to. My son's symptoms were so severe. He would try to suppress, but he couldn't. So yes, that's very, very common. And that's another thing that makes the diagnosis of Tourette more difficult, because, wouldn't it be great if the child goes into the doctor's office and starts doing some of their tics? That would be great. But it's actually not common. What common is that they hold back their tics. And even when you try to get a therapist, they'll deny, no, I don't do that. Or, they'll say they do it on purpose, when really they don't. And kids oftentimes would rather appear to be bad than to be weird. And doing these behaviors is weird. And so sometimes kids will be asked, well, why are you doing that? Well, I just think it's funny. Probably not. So yes, unfortunately, the suppressing is a double-edged sword. When you're in church, it's probably a good idea to be able to suppress. But like this person says, when you get into the car, there's going to be an explosion. So suppression, it can be helpful and it cannot be helpful. But I would recommend, if your doctor, usually doctors will believe the parent, when you say this has been happening. And Tourette won't be diagnosed. Usually it has to be a year of symptoms. But a lot of people do secretly videotape their child to show the doctor.
Thanks, Kathy. I think you may have answered part of this question, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. That the family took their child locally to a neurologist and they didn't get a diagnosis. They said that it was an oral tic and a motor tic that are separate, not Tourette's. So they went and found a new neurologist, but their
Good.
son held back on their oral tics. So how do they get this diagnosis?
Oh, it upsets me that there's a doctor that is saying, well, yeah, he's got oral or vocal tics and he's got motor tics, but he doesn't have Tourette. Well, if you got motor tics and you got vocal tics, you got Tourette. So I'm glad you went to another doctor. And hopefully the other doctor will believe you. And you may want to go to the Tourette Association website and get some information there to give to the doctor. I mean, I find it hard to believe that there's a neurologist that doesn't know about Tourette, and again, you may want to videotape it. It's kind of intrusive, but in order to get a diagnosis and to get what's best for your child, you may need to do that. I just wouldn't let them know you're videotaping, because then they're going to suppress.
Thanks, Kathy. The next question is in regards, they wanted to discuss the rage aspect, that they kind of have heard informally that Tourette's rage can be very quick or quicker at the fuse than maybe other kinds of rage. And they have an 8-year-old who, when this happens, it happens fast and it's hard to disengage them. And they haven't gotten a Tourette's diagnosis yet, but the child has autism, ADHD, OCD, and ODD. No physical tics, but the father has Tourette's.
Ah. They may want to contact me, because I have some videos that I could send. I could email the person. We have a great speech pathologist on our education advisory board who did a great webinar about the difference between autism and Tourette, especially the kids with the rage and with the social communication difficulties. And yes, the rage does seem to come out of nowhere, particularly for younger kids. One of the things that we do in a presentation when we're teaching people about Tourette, and particularly talking about the rage, is we use the Rick Lavoie example of a empty vase. So you've got a kid with sensory issues and ADD and all sorts of other stuff going on. So he wakes up in the morning and his vase is pretty empty. So he gets up and he goes downstairs, and everybody in the family knows he must eat Cheerios. His sister is eating the last bowl of Cheerios. So his vase gets a little bit full, and then he gets on the school bus, and everybody knows what a school bus does to these poor kids. So his vase gets fuller. He gets into school. There's a substitute teacher, and typically the substitute teachers don't know about Tourette. So his vase gets fuller. And then the teacher gives an unannounced quiz. So anxiety. He explodes. And what we do, we look at, what happened right before the explosion, is that, the substitute teacher gave a quiz. And so his response was way out of control. But we need to look at their vase. So his vase was getting fuller and fuller and fuller until it was right up to the top. And it only took a little bit for it to overflow and have a rage issue. So we want to look at, what's happening during the day. How do we reduce that anxiety during the day? How do we help the child? I mean, he's only 8 years old. So sometimes young kids, our son was 4 when he started having rages. And so, it was like a shot glass, when his got full. So sometimes with the younger kids, it does seem to come out of nowhere. But look at their day, how did their day go? What was happening, during the day? And work with the child to help them recognize when their vase is getting fuller. So, and teach them when, what are your physical feelings of when your vase is getting fuller, and when your vase gets halfway full, what can we do that will reduce it? So coming up with strategies, sometimes just going for a walk can change the chemistry in the brain. Sometimes it would, take a glass of water. Sometimes it would take having some food. Ross Green is another person that you want to look at for this, because he's an expert on rage and behavioral difficulties. The Explosive Child was his first book, which was really excellent. So yeah, I get it. It does look like it just comes out of nowhere, and maybe it does. But hopefully you can look at what has happened leading up to the vase overflowing. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you so much, Kathy. I'm going to jump ahead to a quick question where they were looking for the YouTube link from the Tourette Association video on autism versus Tourette's. Can you share the link? So what we can do, again, as well as we can share the link, I can do that after registration. I can send an email to everyone with the link when Kathy finds it. And then, Kathy, do you want to share your email with everyone, or do you want them to reach out? If you reach out to, if you contact the link in the registration, the GoToWebinar, that actually comes straight to me. And actually, I can also, I think I can send a message to everyone in the chat box. I can send you my email, so you can reach out to me here at Starbridge. I will put.
You can feel free to put my email in there.
Okay. Do you want to read it off, and I'll put it in the chat right now?
Yeah, it's Kathy with a K dot Giordano, Giordano at Tourette, TOURETTE.org. I'm not sure that video is on the YouTube page. That might be in the web. I think that might be on their website someplace. I'll have to look it up and send it to you. But feel free to email me, because I mean, this is, I get paid to do this, so feel free to.
But yet your services to parents are free.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm glad you clarified that. Yes, everything that the Tourette Association does is free.
Perfect.
But they pay me.
And I'm glad they do, so everyone, if you scroll down, remember the box with the white arrow in the orange box. If you click on chat, it's in there, or we can read it off again, and you can write it down. It's Kathy, Kathy Giordano, Giordano, the @ TOURETTE.org. Again, it's in your chat box as well. We do have several other questions, Kathy. Another person would like to know, do tics progress as the children age, or do they stay about the same?
Yeah, and like everything else to do with Tourette, it depends. Usually the tics will be at their worst. Well, no, I can't even say that. Sometimes they stay the same. I mean, if a child has, pretty mild Tourette, sometimes they stay the same. Sometimes they will get bigger and change, and sometimes get worse. When puberty hits, sometimes they get worse. With my daughter, puberty made her symptoms much better. And typically when kids get to be in high school, symptoms start to calm down a little bit. I personally think it's when a person has more control over their lives. So as they get into high school, they get a little bit more control. As they get out of school, they got even more control. So typically tics and symptoms get better, but oftentimes they get worse. So I can't really answer that. I wish I could, but.
Thank you. Great question. It looks like this is our last question of the day. Is there a list or a sample 504 accommodations that I can show to my son and have him identify ones which would help him?
Yes, and I can email me and I'll send you that list.
Great. Thank you. What I do want to share with the audience is just a reminder that on May 4th from 12 to 1, Kathy will be talking about behaviors and effective management strategies for children with Tourette syndrome and related neurological conditions. So please remember that. Again, that's May 4th. You can sign up for that as well. So we want you to know that there's still more to come. And on May 12th, IEP and 504 plans for students with Tourette syndrome and related neurological conditions. So 2 more exciting webinars coming up with Kathy Giordano. And with that, Kathy, any last words? Thank you so much. This was very informative and helpful. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate your time, and I will let you have the last word.
I just appreciate everybody that came, because getting awareness about Tourette is the answer. Once everybody becomes aware of Tourette, there's going to be a whole better world for people that have the Tourette. So thank you for attending.
Great. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Hmm.